Good evening, good evening. Let's talk about this class of problem makers. So we published a study, the left to liberal skew of the Western media, and thanks to Noah Carl for this title. You can kind of guess where this is going when I say, when we start talking about it. So we managed to get it out in this obscure journal. It doesn't really matter exactly where it gets out. The point was just this project. It took a long time to do. We began this in 2017, I think, essentially because we found some voting data for northern, shall we say, Scandinavian journalists, and then I tweeted those, and some guy responded with some data for journalists voting in Germany and I think Austria, maybe Switzerland. So we were thinking, wait, if we can get it for 6 countries this fast, how difficult can it be to cover 20 countries? Well, 4 years later, apparently it can be somewhat difficult, but to be fair, most of the time was spent finalizing the last 5% of the study and the write-up and this sort of thing, instead of really gathering the data. The results we got back in 2018 or so, they're more or less the same as now when we have final data. So of course we know how it goes in the media. Media has a particular dislike for people like me, and we have this. The Guardian here a few years ago, they were having a fun time investigating our secret eugenics conference, aka not secret and not eugenics. Nevertheless, the power of the media is essentially you can write whatever you want, you can frame the narrative, you decide what stories and so on. You can also see it in this study showing the attacks on intelligence researchers over time, because if there's one thing the media hate, is that they just hate intelligence research. They hate behavioral genetics, they hate intelligence research. And Noah Carl and Michael Woodley, they did a study some time ago where they essentially looked at attacks of intelligence researchers over time, like whether they got cancelled, like their lectures were cancelled, or media was writing hostile stuff about them, or their grants were rescinded and data sets removed, and so on, right? So 2020 and 20, or I think maybe 19 was particularly bad, and I wouldn't say the current year is particularly much better. So I'm guessing we're gonna go up here. But really we have to go back to basics, because there are some people who deny this left-leaningness of the media, and left-leaning is also kind of a broad point. Maybe you wouldn't say journalists are just particularly into everything left-wing. They are particularly into particular kinds of leftism, but not necessarily all kinds of leftism. And there are a bunch of conservative pundits who claim this sort of thing. It's the media, the lying media again, the Lügenpresse, and so on. There's not much research on this topic, of course, because researchers are also left-wing, so why would they research the left-wing bias of the media? That just helps them, right? The published research that does exist, there is a bunch of studies, maybe 10 or so, kind of nice quant studies, maybe 5 or so, but almost all of these are about the US media, and particularly they quantify text things, and they look at how often think tanks are cited by the media compared to members of the U.S. Congress. The U.S. Congress, their positions, because you have the votes over time, and using statistics on the votes, you can see how left-leaning a particular Congress member is, and you can see how often that particular member cites, some think tanks, the Heartland Institute, it's kind of right-wing one, or the Institute for Family Research, I'm guessing it's also right-wing, or any of the hundreds of left-wing ones. The problem with this kind of a source-based debate is that it's not really applicable to other countries immediately. You can't really compare countries and so on. So there is a need to do another method. Claims about the left-wing bias of the media are quite common. I would say when I talk to other Europeans, Danes, all this stuff, Germans, Brits, they all kind of have the same impression. So this, by stereotype accuracy, of course, you would expect this then to be quite true everywhere, but where's the data, right? Where's the data? So there is a need to investigate many countries. Particularly a nice book on this topic, maybe the only nice book in recent times, based on the study, A Measure of Media Bias, and then Tim Gross-Close, he wrote this book, How the Liberal Media Distorts the American Mind, Left Turn. And essentially about how the media is increasingly kind of left-wing, and they decide which stories get talked about and all this stuff. He provides a very like pop sci introduction to it, but the study that he's relying upon is like this one. There's a few more of these. Media methods for study, like how can you study media bias, like particularly standard method, kind of crude and stupid, is you just look at who owns the media, right? And here, of course, we should have included the tweet by our favorite rocket scientist, who owns the media. That's right. It's interesting about this analysis of like who owns the media. It's used both by like kind of the far left Marxists, because they think, of course, media is owned by big capitalists, and capitalists favor those already in power and so on. They're not big into Antifa and this sort of thing. Well, sort of, but in the Nazis were also doing this. They just see that the media is owned by the Jews, and if you go to kind of a typical like neo-Nazi website today, you'll see a lot of stuff like this. You know, this newspaper owned by that Jew, this newspaper this Jew, blah blah. The general problem is that funders are not much involved with the average daily operations of newspapers. They may take some overall decisions like which editor to hire, this sort of thing, but funders are usually quite wealthy people who are very busy with other things in life, such as sailing on a big yacht. And so they don't really pay attention to the daily operations. The next method often used is content analysis, and essentially the way you do it is, if you're kind of a non-technical person, is that you get a bunch of articles from some newspapers and you kind of rate those based on content and perceived bias and this sort of thing. This way you're kind of putting your own bias into the ratings, and that's why this method is not very good. You'd have to make sure to get like a balanced set of raters, and that makes it quite expensive. If you want to rate 1,000 articles with 3 people per article, you can see how this gets expensive even with student labor. You can do content analysis with machine learning. It has been done for the US media, but it's quite difficult across languages, especially if you want to compare 20 languages. You have to use a bunch of word embeddings and stuff like this to try to put them on a common scale. It's a bit beyond my ability as of talking. So the third way is the one we're looking for here. Is we look just after people who work in the media, and it's simply based on the idea that whoever works in the media, those are the ones who produce the bias. And so if the people who work there, they're quite left-leaning or very in favor of communism or feminism, then their work will reflect this, right? We essentially gather data from journalists, and there's a bunch of studies where they ask journalists, like, how do you place yourself on politics? If you do this sort of thing, you get the journalists kind of place themselves slightly to the left, but not so much. That's a problem of self-perception. So we prefer voting data, because voting data is always with reference to the general population, and you can find a general election closely, which you can then compare to. So here's the example of the left-leaningness of journalists, and they use this 0 to 10 scale. So 5 will be in the mean, and what you can see is that the mean leaning of journalists, according to themselves, is essentially slightly to the left, and somehow they they rate their own employment place as slightly to the right. But of course we know that newspapers are quite left-leaning areas of life, and journalists are quite more left-leaning than they think. So what we really have here is that journalists are unable to estimate themselves because they kind of live in a bubble. This effect, of course, not of course, but it's called the reference group. And the thing is that when you're using these kind of place yourself, you think to your mind, and you come up with like some group you're comparing yourself with, and these will be people kind of you're met in your life, or your wider social circle. And of course, if you work on the East Coast and for some like New York Times, you're living in New York, and you mostly hang out with other like journalists or even academic types, and these are also very far left-leaning. So of course, if you think of this reference group, well, maybe you're not that far left, but that's of course because you're in a bubble. If you were comparing yourself to the farmers in Minnesota and the Deep South, then maybe things would be a bit different. The other thing that's interesting is that if you check political leanings and perception accuracy, it goes like this. in this website, it's kind of cool. I unfortunately did not put it here, but the one that website is about, it asks you which proportion of, say, Republicans agree that Trump has character flaws or something, or which proportion of Republicans agree that the climate needs saving or something like this. And so you try to estimate the outgroup, so to say. And you also do this for the in-group, and you can see how much wrong are you about the outgroup. And what you get is that you get this pattern is that people who are far left and people who are far right, and by US standards here, they are quite unable to estimate the beliefs of the outgroup. They're simply living in a bubble where they don't really understand the actual beliefs of the other side, right? They're not really paying attention enough. This is, of course, kind of a horseshoe thing where these groups down here have much more in common than they kind of let on, right? They hate each other, particularly, but in many ways the mentality of the far left and the far right is quite similar, and this goes back to Hans Eysenck's writing on politics in the 1950s. This also has the effect that you get this kind of effect. If you are actually yourself on the far left, then everybody seems quite far right? Which is true. I mean, relative to you, if you're far left, is that everybody else really is kind of far away from you, and in that sense they're far right. And this gives rise to these obvious memes where you can find an unlimited number of people essentially on Twitter who is calling literally everything is Hitler, and literally everything is Nazis this, Nazis that, eugenics, blah blah blah. And that's just kind of like that's how their mind works for these things. It's interesting. You can also get some research like this, right-wing bias in journalist perception of public opinion, and it's that this one essentially also shows similar things to the other one, that the journalists are unable to estimate the public. They think they're more right-wing than the public really is. It's more or less the same as this study, except it's been done with journalists too. So we know that this kind of pattern holds also for journalists. And so this really, what it really means is that journalists are so left-wing that they're unable to really estimate properly the beliefs of normal people. So that was kind of a tour of the research that has been done and the kind of background model. The way we have the data, so the way we have all this data, how do we go about interpreting it and using it? So what we use is a distortion model or distortion theory, which we will get to in a second. It looks like this. Essentially, the idea is that there's a universe of potential stories, just like things that happen. New data are published. Some politician says this or that, like tweets this or that. Who decides which one of these to make a story about? That's some journalist. And so let's say journalists are quite red, so that's if you're not American, then red means left-wing, just like the color of socialism. And essentially there's potential stories, and from those you sample the ones, but with some bias, and those are the stories that chosen that you want to talk about. For those stories, you can then choose which sources to use. And again, anytime a politician has any kind of tweet, there's going to be a bunch of replies, and you can choose which of those replies you want to take. You can find some left-leaning guy who says, yeah, this politician is really bad, right? Or you can find some right-leaning guy saying, this wasn't so bad. There are a lot of decisions like this, and essentially these are not made at random, right? But they reflect the views of the journalists themselves. Potential framings, again, you have many ways to talk about a given politician. You could call them someone who's tough on immigration, or you could call him an immigration skepticist, or you could call him an Islamophobe or Mexican hater or something. There are many ways to frame exactly the same person, and then finally you end up with this story. And so every step of this process, the story gets somewhat more biased towards the views of the journalists. That's the distortion model. It works quite similar to science, as we'll see. So the same reason is, of course, why you study academics' political leanings is that beliefs affect behavior, the most obvious conclusion ever. So we went about this, the choice of stories, the choice of sources, framing, is Charles Murray, white nationalist, blah, blah, controversial. No one can really pretend that political views do not affect behavior. In fact, there's lots of social psychology that replicates well, thank you, that shows exactly this sort of thing. It's the priming stuff that doesn't replicate. Anyway, so the interesting thing about this is that essentially social ecologists have put journalists in a bad spot, because if we can show that journalists are quite far left-leaning, well, and it beliefs affect behavior, then the media must be biased. And there's no escape from this if you already believe that beliefs affect behavior, which of course social scientists believe. So essentially, that's the method here. And the definition of bias is quite simple. It's just that your political leanings are not representative of the country. And so if you're further to the right or further to the left and so on, or in some other direction, libertarian, then you're just not representative. In that sense, you can said to be biased. You're not a representative sample. So with that aside, let's talk about the data. The voting data is not that easy to get. Not much data exists in academic journal papers. We searched a lot and generally could not find much. There's some for sometimes some US data. If you check more gray literature things, dissertations, books, then you find some data. There was one like dissertation from Canada, which apparently is the only kind of place you can find some voting data for this country for the last 20 years. It's kind of amazing, but that seems to be the case. Local language sources, that seems to be where you mostly get this, because often what happens is that some journalist in some country gets the idea that, wait, who do journalists vote for? And then they kind of do a survey in their own media, or maybe even some of the other media, and then they publish an article about this, but only in the local language, and so it will not show up in Google Scholar. It's difficult to find. You basically need someone who can read a bunch of languages. So that's what we got. We paid and otherwise searched. We posted on subreddits. Subreddit Croatia, can you find us any article about Croatian journalist voting? This sort of thing. I tweeted a bunch of times. I checked my Twitter followers from different countries, who speaks French, who speaks Slovenian, and so on, right? And so that's how we got all these sources, and that's how we did this. The party data itself, now that you have who votes for what with percentages, so you have like surveys of journalists, and for every country and this journalist at some time, you know that journalists vote X% for this party and Y% for some other party. Then you go to Wikipedia, you find the general election that's closest in time, or the two ones, and you average them, and then you see how close or how far is the deviation from what you'd expect based on the general public. So that kind of gives you the journalist relative preference. As we'll see, it is a bit more complicated. Anyway, the next thing is that you need some party data. So for every of these parties, you need to estimate what is the political position of this party. Is it left, right? What kind of ideologies does it have? So the first obvious way we found here was that you can actually just check Wikipedia, the English Wikipedia. I've checked the page for the Sweden Democrats here. Those are the ones that are often labeled far right. And what you can see is that there's kind of an information box or info box, and it has the political position down here, right wing to far right, and it has the ideology. And the ideology essentially is just labels that published sources that Wikipedia sites have used for this party. So they're like social conservatism, national conservatism, right-wing populism, anti-immigrationism, blah blah. So these are the ideology specific ones, and this is the position. And if you take the position and you say far right, that is free, and far left is minus free, then you get this distribution of all the parties in our sample. And so all the parties in our sample cover the 200 or so parties that exist in these countries that we had data for. So that is the 17 countries, 17 Western countries, all the political parties in those that have this box. We scraped all of that. We have all these labels, and we get this position. So essentially what we get is that it's kind of normal, but it's bimodal in the sense that there's a medium voter fresh theorem thing going on, where essentially a lot of countries have a big center-right party and a big center-left party. I see that these labels are swapped, but aside from that, essentially that's how it looks. And so we were then thinking, what about Wikipedia itself? That's also biased, right? Because Wikipedia positions are just based on the media writing about what parties are. Okay, so what about another solution? So we hired 25 research assistants to redo the ratings every of these parties, and there's roughly 200 parties, 197, and 183 of them are also in the Wikipedia dataset. And what we get is this: if you take the average rating from each person and compare that to the Wikipedia one, you get this correlation of 8:6, very strong correlation. This dotted line shows the perfect, the one-to-one slope. And so what we really see here is interesting is that the raters here, so there are mostly kind of students and stuff, they don't really rate as many far-right parties as Wikipedia does. So the parties here on Wikipedia, those are the ones that Wikipedia considers to be purely far-right, and the ones here, those are the ones it labels right to far-right, so they're kind of halfway. So the National Front, for instance, is considered kind of here. It's the one where it's close to the agreement line. But a lot of these parties, they're considered, like this one is considered center-left by raters, but somehow right-wing by Wikipedia. And there are some outliers like this, but nevertheless, the agreement is quite good. It wasn't exactly clear which of these ratings is best to use. After all, most of these research assistants were Danish students. They were maybe center-right leaning on average. Some of them are libertarians and stuff. So it's possible that these ratings also have some bias. So we ran everything in dual, like we ran all the regressions and so on with both sets of ratings. And so essentially that's the data that we have. We have 17 countries covered: Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Netherlands, Belgium, France, UK, Ireland, USA, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Poland. Those are the ones we have. Unfortunately, we don't have big countries like Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and most East European ones, simply because we were unable to find any surveys about voting for these countries, and we even contacted people and we wanted to pay for them, but we just cannot find a single survey of Italian journalists, apparently. There are about 120 parties that provide useful voting data, and the reason for that is that some parties were extremely small, and so they're not useful because the statistics for them are estimated too imprecisely. So those could not be used, and we end up with a decent sample of 120 parties. Before going into the results, we need to talk a little bit about the quantification here. And so there is no obvious standard method, I understand, here to quantify this. Like, if you know that journalists vote 20% for one party and the public votes 10% for them, you could say journalists vote 10% more for them than the other one. So this is simply the difference in percent points, right? The delta. We're calling it D. On the other hand, you could also say, look, journalists, they vote 20%, the general public is 10%, so the journalists prefer twice as much. And this gives you the relative radio of the risk here. A variant on this is the odds ratio, and for those who are familiar with logistic regression and so on, this is the one to use, because if you have a party that's gets 60% of the vote in the general population and 100% among the journalists, I mean, it's impossible for this party to get a relative ratio of 2 among journalists, because the votes cannot go above 100%. And so instead of using the denominator, instead of using the entire 100% vote, you basically use the remaining probability, and when you do this, you get this odds ratio instead. And it has some nice mathematical properties, but ultimately in our data it gives almost the same result as the relative radio, so it's not much worth going into, but I'm just pointing it out that in case there's some autistic viewers with us. So in this case, if we say journalists vote 35% for a party and the general public is 10%, the journalists vote 25% more for it, or 3.5 times, or odd ratio of 485. So that's how these are the numbers that we're using for each party. Each country is then assigned this. If there's more than one survey in each country, we average across the surveys to get these values. And that is the preference for this party in that country. Zooming out, back out, we get this overall results. This is based on the Wikipedia data. So, and here we have 119 parties. Those are the ones that had they did not involve super small parties and did not have totally broken data, or just was missing data in general. We get this pattern that if we look at this one, that's the one where we just have the D value over here. That's just the difference, and we see that the journalists they quite prefer these center-leftist parties, more than the public. Not necessarily the far left, but also like the left parties, but definitely the center left. That's where the strongest is. It's somewhat non-linear, you see, with the blue line here. And the far right parties over here, or the right-wing parties, they get 10% less, or maybe even 20% less percent votes among the journalists. And in the correlation terms, this comes out to a minus, almost minus 0.5. If we instead use the relative risk, it goes here. I've simply log scaled it, and otherwise it would be non-linear in this scale. That would not be good. You also get a correlation of this, and you get the same kind of pattern where the journalists have some preference. Their journalist preferred is like center left, not necessarily far left, but like center left. These are like kind of a socially liberal, like green type parties. They tend to be in this position, and those seems to be the preferred ones of journalists. Down here, like some of these parties, like once you get to the right wing parties, the journalists are voting, I don't know, 20% as much as the general population. And over here, it's more like 1.5 times as much or so. If we use the oops, what does it say? Yeah. If we use the rating, the rated data instead, we have a few more countries or parties, and it looks like this. You get more or less the same results. So the correlations are still around -5. You still get the kind of a non-linear pattern where the journalist preferred party is roughly between left and center left, and you also get this with the relative ratio up here. So no matter where you get the ratings from, whether Wikipedia or raters, and whether you use the d-value or the relative ratio, you get kind of the same slightly nonlinear pattern where there's a strong tilt to the left, but it stops. There's a diminishing returns of leftism, so to say. And we can then wonder about this result. Is it robust if we change the inclusion rules? And so what we had here was that we didn't have we had a exclusion rule that says parties that get below 2% of the vote. I believe it says on this slide somewhere. Yeah, 2% of the vote. If those are excluded, and so that's why we get this result here. So you may now wonder, what if we remove this result? We just used all the parties we have data for, 151. The correlations would they would be a little bit weaker if we keep making the threshold stronger, so that we exclude more and more smaller parties. In fact, the result become a bit stronger. One obvious reason for this is that a lot of the estimates for these very small parties are they're quite noisy. You can see why if you're looking for a party that gets 2% of the general vote, and you have to estimate how many percent journalists vote for this party, and if you only survey 50 journalists, one journalist, that's going to be 2%. If you accidentally survey or get 3 people who support this party, it looks like the journalists are 3 times in favor, whereas they might in fact not be in favor of it at all. And so the standard error is very large for the relative ratio and for these small parties. And so you see, when you make the standard error smaller, the results become stronger, and we're very happy. So now let's talk about the political ideologies, and to recap, those are the ones that exist in these tags here, the ideology tags, and we download all those as well, and you get this set of 21 ideologies, and you can see which proportions exists. Like 45% of parties or so are labeled conservative, liberalism is like 40%, and so on. Somehow it's roughly even with the EU positive and EU skeptic, although it seems that the EU positive is more of the norm, but the ones who are extremely positive gets this label, and the ones that are kind of negative in any direction get this one. And anyway, that's essentially what you get. Some of the ones were recoded or merged. If they were too rare, we kind of merged them, like Catalan nationalism. Maybe that should become like regionalism or this sort of thing. There were a few of these weird centrist ones, syncretic and so on. But generally, this is the distribution you get, and those are the data we can then throw into a model. Before throwing into a model, however, we can look at it this way, and in this case we have the preferences for the journalist, and on here we have the relative ratio. So over here it's things that journalists vote more for in terms of the ratio, and over here it's less. So we see, for instance, the people who get the most slack from journalists, I guess, the National Conservatives, they get something like 6 times as many votes among the public as they do among journalists. And so if they get 20% among the public, it would probably be difficult to find even a single journalist that would be outward and saying, look, I vote for this party, because then they would get harassed by their colleagues. And it's the same kind of thing with other things: nationalism, EU skepticism, libertarianism. I would guess libertarianism is not so much hated nowadays, but in general, though, you get this pattern. Over here, you see what does a journalist particularly vote for. It's green parties, feminist, EU positive, some socialism, democratic socialism, communism, all these kind of left of center things. They have quite a bit of extra support from journalists. But the most friendly thing to journalists seems to be the green parties. They're the darlings of journalists, and you have all these media talking about the climate crisis and all these other kind of fake things. And this is not exactly a coincidence. There's something about green parties and green ideology that appeals both to some proportion of voters and to journalists. I would guess it has something to do with being bad with numbers and kind of emotional and bad with numbers, and essentially kind of having a woman's mindset. So we can also ask multivariate analysis. What if we want to predict the relative support of a given party, and we want to take into account both the party's political position and the party's ideology tags? Can we do that? Whoops, the ideology tags are these ones. Can we do that? And as you can see, if we have 120 data points, those are the parties across countries, and we have roughly 20 predictors, the political leanings, and say roughly 20 ideology tags, this regression will not be stable. This will not work. So economists, they have had a similar situation where they have only a set number of countries in the world, maybe 180, or that's if you can get data for everybody, which you can't, because African countries didn't collect much data, and South Asian countries didn't also collect much data. So Latin American, not so much data. So you kind of left in recent decades with data only for long running data you can only get for a bunch of Western countries and some of their colonies, and newer data you can get from everybody, but then you don't have so many years. So they come up with this method, Bayesian model averaging. Essentially, the idea is that you can't fit a model that is accurate using every predictor at once. However, you can maybe fit every single possible model, and that is to say, you fit all the combinations of models. So for every predictor, you can say we can leave it in or we can take it out. So that gives you 2 options. Then the second predictor, there's 2 more options, and the third, and so on, right? So it's 2 times 2 times 2 times, and so on, minus 1 at the end, because the last one is an empty model. So that essentially is what this does. And so if you have a big enough computer and you have 20 predictors, you can try all, I don't actually know how many that is, many millions of models, and that will take maybe some hours. Otherwise, what you do is that you simply try models at random, and so you simply select random combinations of predictors, you fit that submodel, you save the results. And you do this maybe 1 million times, and now you have sampled 100 or 1 million models of the possible 100 million or something. And this sampling was completely random and therefore representative. Then you rank order these models using some statistical metric like the adjusted R squared or Bayesian information criterion, this one BIC, and then you can rank order models, which ones tend to be better, which ones are worse. And then finally you say, if we zoom into, say, the top 500 models, or the top 1,000 out of the 1 million, which kind of variables tend to be included in those? And those variables are the ones that are the most important, because they seem to be useful across models that are good, right? And so you get this, the main interest thing is the PIP, that's the probability of inclusion in the top models. So that essentially tells you, of the 1,000, say, top models, how many of those 1,000 contains this one predictor that you're interested in, that you think is important, say left-leaningness. And how that's the PIP, right? It just tells you whether it's in the best models or not. And a good variable, important variable, should be included in the best models, right? It's like leaving IQ out of stuff, then you just get bad models. The best models kind of must contain IQ, or like a very large number of other variables to proxy it. The other important is the post-beta mean, and what it means is simply that among the top 1,000 best models, what is the average or the posterior or the mode? What is the average beta of this predictor? So if this model has a beta for this one predictor at 0.1, and the second model is 0.2, and so on, the third is 0.15, you average across all of these, and you get the best kind of across model estimate of what is the predictive validity or the predictiveness of this one predictor. And similarly, you can get the standard deviation. The positive sign percent is just like, do they even agree which direction the effect goes in? So if essentially this one should always be either 1 or 0, so that they're all positive or all negative. And if it gets close to 50, then it seems it's just kind of a chance. Then it could be like a suppressor or something. With that said, it's a bit complicated. It's also more complicated in that set because there's some Bayesian stuff with priors and this sort of thing. But we're skipping over that, and we get to these results. They're a bit hard to read here, but it was a bit difficult to summarize them better. Maybe should have made a plot. Anyway, what we do is that I've sorted them, I think, by utility over here, and what we get is that we look at the pip first to see which predictors are consistently selected. And this one is based on the Wikipedia data, and this one is based on the rating data. So let's just look at the Wikipedia based first, and we can see that the model, the things that the model wants to predict over here, we try to predict the vote difference. So that's the D value, like the difference in votes from journalists and normal people. And if you want to predict which parties get more votes in this sense, then conservative is very important to include. It's included in 97% of the good models, and 90% for the EU positive. Green is 57, nationalism 46, direct democracy 35, and the rest is even smaller. So what you get then is that these predictors up here seem to be quite important, and you can look at the posterior mean here in that sense. That tells you, like, taking the other things into account, a party with the label conservative receives 9.6% fewer votes among the journalists than they do among the population at large. That's what this number tells us. If you look at the EU positive, it says 6.7, and that's the proportion that's the percentage more votes they get among journalists, and so on, and 4.4 down here, and 3, and so on. So these down here, these numbers are too small to care about, so we won't talk about them. Direct democracy is also something journalists like, at least in theory. And so we can see the numbers here are 0, 1, 1, 0, and so on. They're extremely consistent, and so we can be kind of confident that these things are useful. Interestingly, we don't see the left-leaningness itself here, and that's just because it wasn't a good predictor once you include the tags. So it seems that while there is an association with leftism per se, it is better to think of it as journalists being opposed to these specific kind of things like conservatism, and being in favor of specific kind of things like EU positivism, EU stuff, and Green parties. That's even feminism to some degree, but not left-leaning per se. At least it's down here, right? And it has a very small effect. It's only included in the 6% models. If we then go over here, now we're looking at the log 10 of the relative ratio. So it's a different way of quantifying the same data, and hopefully there should be some consistency across these. And we see that is not exactly the case. We see that the best predictor here is left-wing populism, and so these would be kind of like maybe Bernie Sanders style stuff. And then this one seems to be quite a good predictor. Green parties, again, nationalism is down here. So there is some consistency. Green, nationalism, conservative, they're all here. Now political position comes back. Before it was down here. So you can see that the exact inclusion of which predictors here depends on how the data is encoded, and that's just kind of unfortunate, but nothing much we can do about that. But still, there's some degree of consistency, which things that they like and which things they don't like. They like green, they don't like left-wing populism somehow. I'm not exactly sure how this result comes, but this is like the strongest result. But well, it doesn't actually, it's not very strong over here, so it has something to do with the Wikipedia position compared to the radar positions, and so it's not really consistent, and probably it's a fluke in some sense. If we then check the radar data, so this is the same as this one. We're looking at the difference in the voter percent. We see again the conservatives in the top, EU, green. These results mirror these results. Nationalism, direct democracy, it's more or less the same over here. Political position is now a bit stronger here than it is down here. Maybe this means that these data are more valid. We saw, as you saw before, that there were some suspicious outliers, like Forum of Social Republicans. How can this be a right-wing party? It's called social something. It's probably more like a left party. Nevertheless, that's the difference here. But the important more to focus on the things that go again. Conservative, EU, positive, green, nationalism, these things, national conservatism. Again, if we look at the log 10 of the relative ratio, green, national conservatism, agrarianism, nationalism. These are many of the things that go again. Now EU positivism is down here, but it's there in most of the place. So that's essentially what you get with this data. It's not as clear-cut as certain as you would like, but when you have 20 predictors and only 120 data points, you can't really do much magic. You can p-hack it and PO4 here and there, but reality is that the results will be somewhat grainy and not so crisp. We can, I guess, try to collect more data, and hopefully we'll do that in the future. But this is how political bias currently looks like, according to our study. We can also zoom out, and we can integrate this with the broader perspective in academia, and so we kind of have the science academia journalist ecosystem, whereas we both have the bias of a journalist over here, red for left wing, and the scientist one is even more left wing. And the kind of science goes around in this, and we can say that there is some new publication and it supports this fashionable theory, and then it receives media attention, and the theory also gets media attention, and that's of course produced by the journalists. Now when you get more media attention, then the PR team is happy at university, and then you can get more funding, right? Then you leverage your media attention in the New York Times or the Guardian or something, you get more funding. Now when you get more funding, you can hire more PhD students, you can collect more data. So now you can do more research, then you do more studies, more findings, result in publications. Of course, you want to get more media attention, so you're going to filter your publications based on both your own bias, but also just with your mind in the future, like how do I get more grant money? Maybe I should study something the media likes, this sort of thing. And so you get this kind of round and round the ecosystem the things go, and with the bias that comes into the system from these two sources. That's not to say there's no bias from the funding system also, but in particular, I think the effect of journalists and scientists themselves is very strong on science. And we can also think about recent times. Here we have Swedish data. In Sweden, they have been doing this survey of journalists for many years, and they repeat them every 2 years or so. I think Norway also has this. And it's interesting because you can see that journalism didn't used to be that far left-leaning, and it started roughly in the 60s or so, right? It really takes speed here in the late 60s. That's really when the decay started. And this color is the left block, so that's all the left-leaning parties together. And this color is the right block. Unfortunately, these should have been like up here or something, but that was difficult. So we have this up here and they had this here. So back then it used to be 50-50. There used to be parity. The media wasn't biased in 1970. Maybe because there are a lot more regional journalists and this sort of thing. They were much more down to earth and in contact with their readers and this sort of thing. And now that almost all journalists, I think, now live in big cities. And so it's all national media. And so now we have a ratio of, 2 to 1 or approaching 3 to 1 for journalists left and right here in Sweden with these data. I cannot see when this data seems to be from 2005 here. Maybe there's some newer data. Also here we look at specific parties. We can see the decline of this party. I think that's the Social Democratic Party, and they've kind of been popular. They were always popular with journalists, but they've kind of just been declining, and it really kind of mirrors this one, the rise of the Green Party. That seems to be where the journalists are mostly going. Or wait, that's left party, sorry. The Green Party is this one that spikes here, and especially like recent times, and the journalists just really love Green Parties. That seems to be where things are headed here. So we don't really have the great awakening here, because that would be 2015 to now, but we see that this pattern of increasing left wing in the media has, and specifically the green turn, that has been ongoing for some time. So that's essentially what we find with longitudinal data. There are some data like this for the US that shows something similar, and probably the Norwegian, I cannot remember what the Norwegian data said. We didn't want to put too many of these in our article, which was already like 50 pages long. There is more data one could look into for these, and we'll probably be looking more into this and doing some more surveys about public opinion of journalists. So in conclusion, this is where we are. There's a large left-wing skew of the journalists' voting behavior. Correlations are about -5. Depending on how you quantify it, you get 4.7 or 5.2 or something like this, but it's pretty clear across countries. So in each country, what you can do is that you can take the general, you can take the election, and you can say what is the left-right leaning of the election in terms of which parties they vote for, and you can also do that for the journalists. And so you get a mean political position by a journalist and a mean political position by the general population, and you simply subtract those, you get a score, the bias score of the journalist. How far displaced are they from the general population? And you can then sort this. And what we've done here is that we see that Austria apparently seems to have the most bias in journalism, followed by France, Switzerland, Denmark, Ireland, and Sweden, Norway. Somehow Slovenia is quite low, and Germany is quite low. I think Germany is low because after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the party that was in charge in East Germany, they had very poor performance among journalists just after that, and this is kind of a communist far left party, and that's why this is lower. I think that if you only use the newer data, this bias would be a lot stronger. These data should be taken with a very big grain of salt, because when you go into a single survey, often with small sample size of journalists, and then trying to estimate this, there's a lot of uncertainty in the rank order of these. We did the same one based on the rater-based political positions, and here we get we got also the biases, and they not exactly the same rank order, but pretty close to it. And the reason the USA is missing over here is that Wikipedia does not have any political position data for the US, and that's because there's only two parties. So you could label them left and right, but that Wikipedia somehow does not do this. And but when we had the raters do it, they of course have it. That's why it appears for the raters, not the other one. Still, Austria gets political position number 1. I think Austria is quite conservative in terms of the general population, and the journalists are quite left-wing also there, and so this creates this particularly large contrast. Ideology tag analysis. Those are the specific ideology tags on Wikipedia. We show that journalists particularly don't like conservatism, nationalism, and national conservatism. These are the things that go again across these analysis we looked at here. Some things were popped up in one analysis, but were consistent in the other 4. So here we kind of summarized the ones that were pretty consistent. They particularly like Green Party's feminism and EU globalism. Those are the strongest ones we see down here. So essentially global homo stuff and climate. That's not surprising. No one here. And experiments are really needed also to quantify the effects of this kind of bias, because the next thing, of course, is that the social scientists they're going to do a 180 and say, like, okay, journalists, they're immune to their own biases because they have strict training in journalism, blah blah, and this magic education makes them immune to political bias, and essentially that's going to be the next argument. So you want to do some experiments, preferably with journalists if you can, to show that indeed if you put people in a kind of a newsroom and people have to make decisions or fake decisions, like which story, how to label someone, then of course the political leaning of the person making these decisions affects their behavior. It's totally obvious stuff. But I found one experiment, and only one experiment of this sort, and I didn't actually cite it in the paper because I found it afterwards, but I wrote to the author, because this paper is from the 1990s, and there's 2 authors, one of them has died. I wrote the other one, I said, look, are there any publications of this study? And he said, we were thinking of doing one, but we just didn't do it. And so it's been 20 years, and there's apparently only one survey experiment kind of that did this thing where you put journalists into a kind of an artificial newsroom and had them make decisions, and then it's kind of showed the obvious, as you'd expect. But in general, to the really conclusion of this paper is, of course, that stereotypes were confirmed, and journalists can keep posting their L's. See ya.